Hello yet again, everyone. Welcome to the fourth and final installment in our Chapter 8 lecture series. This one entitled The Second War for Independence. The focus question for this section is, what were the causes and significant results of the War of 1812? Before we actually get to the War of 1812, however, we need to discuss the continued Indian problem in the Western lands. The growing crisis between the United States and Britain took place against a background of deteriorating Indian relations in the West. Jefferson purchased Indian land and supports Indian relocation to the West. Some Indians endorsed the federal policy known as civilization, where as long as Indians accepted Western ways of life, including settled agriculture, and in some cases even owning slaves, then they could be acculturated and assimilated into American society. However, there was another group of nativist Indians who wished to root out European influences during what became known as the Age of Prophecy. And that brings us to the story of Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa. Tecumseh was a Shawnee Indian leader who put together a new pan-Indian alliance against U.S. encroachment onto Indian lands. And he had a brother, Tenskwatawa, who was a medicine man and considered a prophet among the Native American peoples. And he is the reason why this period among Native Americans is known as the Age of Prophecy. He called for the complete separation of Native Americans from whites and white culture and a revival of Indian religion and ways of life. This in particular involved the abandonment of alcohol, which was a rampant problem among Native American communities, as well as manufactured goods. And he called for attacks on frontier settlements to drive away white settlers. Now, Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa and their pan-Indian alliance was ultimately defeated in 1811 by William Henry Harrison at the Battle of Tippecanoe. But that wasn't necessarily the end of this particular period of Native American pushback against the United States, as many of those same Native Americans who participated in this pan-Indian alliance with Tecumseh and Tenskwatawa took the side of the British in the War of 1812. And all of this pan-Indian alliance, led in part by a medicine man or Native American prophet, certainly has echoes of that previous Pontiac's Rebellion that we talked about just a few lectures ago. And that brings us to the War of 1812 itself, which actually lasted from 1812 to 1815. James Madison asked Congress for a declaration of war following continued British assaults on American shipping. It became very apparent after France had given up its attacks on American ships and Britain did not, that Britain had no intention on curtailing its activities against the United States and American shipping. The war essentially bankrupted the federal government. Britain invaded the United States, seized Washington, D.C., and burned the Capitol and the White House to the ground. All in all, there were few American victories in this two-front war against the British and their Native American allies. However, the United States was able to, much like in the Revolutionary War, hold the British off long enough to where the British will to fight and the public opinion in Britain turned against the war, so essentially the British abandoned the effort. And by the time the Battle of New Orleans, the most famous engagement of the entire war took place, the treaty to end the war had already been signed. But the news had not yet reached Andrew Jackson, who was commanding the American forces in New Orleans, or the British that were planning the assault against him. The Battle of New Orleans was actually a decisive American victory, the only real decisive American victory of the entire war, and ironic that it came after the war actually ended, technically. But the American victory at the Battle of New Orleans certainly did do much to increase American morale and secure the fact that the Americans, while they may not have technically won the war according to the stipulations of the treaty, they had won the war in spirit and essentially proved their mettle against the dominant British military. As I said, the Treaty of Ghent was actually negotiated and signed prior to the Battle of New Orleans actually taking place, and essentially the Treaty of Ghent restored the previous status quo of the diplomatic and international relations between the two countries from prior to the war even beginning. So there was no one really gained or lost anything technically in this war. And while the United States, again, didn't technically win the war militarily on the battlefield, it did win the war of morale, of spirit, and again, established the United States as a force to be reckoned with, that Europe could no longer look down their noses on, at least not to the same degree they had before, and certainly couldn't negate America's continued and growing influence on the world stage. So what exactly did the war accomplish? Well, number one, it signaled the rise of Andrew Jackson as a war hero, a status that Jackson would later ride all the way to the presidency of the United States. It also completed the conquest of the area east of the Mississippi River, all those lands west of the Appalachians but east of the Mississippi that the United States had gained at the end of the Revolutionary War, that had been fought over between the United States and Native Americans in that entire period between the two wars. All those tribes that allied with Britain during the War of 1812 essentially lost most of their status and lands as a result of their participation in the War of 1812, and essentially opened up most of that area east of the Mississippi River, except for some small pockets where, especially like the Cherokee and the Choctaw and tribes like that, still existed in some small areas in that region. But by and large, the conquest of that huge swath of land was completed as a result of the War of 1812. It also confirmed once and for all United States independence from Great Britain and its ability to hold its own against a foreign power. No longer would Great Britain seek to interfere in American affairs or plot or plan in any sort of way to regain the colonies it had lost. Another significant outcome of the war was the end of the Federalist Party. And this was really presaged by the Hartford Convention in late 1814. The Federalists gathered in Hartford, Connecticut in opposition to the war and lamenting the diminishing influence of New England in domestic affairs. And they proposed a whole series of new ideas and laws and stipulations that they thought would address or redress those issues. Rumors had it that they even discussed succession of the entire New England area from the United States at this time. Now, most historians by now seem to push back against this idea that discussion was actually, or succession was actually discussed. But they also certainly did discuss nullification, the idea that states could nullify federal laws, which up until this point had been a point made by mostly Southerners up until at this stage of the game. The Federalists in general, their opposition to the war, and all of their efforts to try to undermine the war efforts, and of course the fact that the Federalists in general were more inclined towards Great Britain in general, they were seen as lacking patriotism, and even so much as seen as colluding with the enemy. And the end of the Hartford Convention was very, well, fortuitous for their enemies, because the news of the Hartford Convention reached Washington just a hair's breadth late of the news of the victory of Andrew Jackson at the Battle of New Orleans, which of course unleashed all sorts of patriotic fervor in the United States in the emotional aftermath of such a great victory, which made the Federalists look even worse in the eyes of most Americans at the time. And of course you had this rising democratic ethos that was still steadily building strength and steam as time progressed, which was completely at odds with the elitism of the Federalist Party. And essentially, after the scandal that became the Hartford Convention, the Federalists essentially lost all credibility with most of the American public, and the party itself withered and crumbled and no longer was any factor in the American political realm from here on out. Well, that's it, everyone. That's the end of our Chapter 8 lecture series. As always, I hope you learned a lot. Study hard, and I'll see you soon.